Hello and welcome to Lesson 6. This one is called Revisiting the Research Process. So we're obviously going to review another skill from English 101, but as always we're going to build on top of that knowledge. And only the first part of this lecture will address things you learned in 101, and we're going to very quickly move to new things that you're learning in this class. That'll be very helpful to you in the real world in classes beyond this one. And the emphasis here is the research process. Before we get into that, I want to address where we're at in the quarter, what we're doing next and now, and how that will carry us through to the end of the quarter. Because you just finished up your first major paper with the fake news analysis, and that marks the midpoint, the midterm of the quarter. So now we're into the second half. What are we doing in this second half and why? Well, we're starting a new project, your second major writing project, and actually our way into discussing the research process in this lesson is going to be by introducing you to the second paper. A question you might immediately have is, why look at an assignment prompt for an assignment that's not due for 5 weeks? Well, as we talked about when we reviewed the writing process a few lessons ago, to do great writing, you have to plan. You have to come up with a topic. You have to develop that topic. You have to do multiple drafts. You have to revise multiple drafts. That all takes time. In really this class, the major assignments are the major papers. There aren't tests or exams. So if writing is a process, and the main way I evaluate you are through your writing projects, then we should really spend everything we do in the class working on those projects, even if we're just building them a piece at a time. That's why I call them projects rather than papers. And to drive home the idea that writing is much more than just writing a paper, it's an entire process that goes into creating that composition. So we're actually going to spend 5 weeks working on this paper, and every lesson we do between now and the end of the quarter will be one step toward composing that paper. We'll all build toward it. So everything you do throughout the rest of the quarter will be useful to you in doing your final project, and that final project itself will teach you skills that will be useful, like I said, beyond this class and other classes and in the real world that exists outside our classroom. So that's why we're going to look at this assignment prompt today, and that's why we're going to discuss the research process, because research is a major part, a major component of this paper. So first we'll look at the assignment prompt itself. Second part of the lecture, we'll review the research process from 101, and then in the final 2 parts, we'll look at 2 examples of texts that illustrate what I'm asking you to do. So I'll go over the assignment prompt, then I'll go over the research process, because research is a big part of it. But what is a research analysis of a cultural artifact? You'll see a really good example of one in part 3, and then you'll see another really good example of one in part 4. One quick comment here. Example 1 should say the cultural struggle. Just one more game is an article I teach in a different class, so that's a typo, a mistake. I apologize for that. And since I'm mentioning that now, I'll real quickly note that we already read the cultural struggle, so in your reading assignments, it said review next to it, so you could just kind of skim that piece. But the Halloween piece at the end of the lecture is totally new. Okay, so let's take a look at the assignment prompt and see what I'm asking you to do for this project. The first thing you might be thinking is, what is a cultural artifact and why are we studying one? Popular culture. Pop being short for popular, meaning something, a film, a TV show, a book, a comic book, a video game, whatever, from our culture. If it's popular, That means it's reflective of our culture. It's popular for a reason. So if we study it, we can learn about the values and the beliefs of the people in that culture. Studying why it was popular at that time teaches us about that culture. So it's a cultural artifact. Doing a research analysis of a cultural artifact then can help us learn about the culture, but more so it can help us make our own arguments, voice our opinions about the issues in that culture. Pop culture can be a tool, a means, if you will, of talking about the cultural and societal issues. And that's exactly what I'm asking you to do for this assignment. So, to state it in the simplest terms possible, take a clear stance on an important real-world issue and analyze a cultural artifact as evidence to prove your argument. Let's break this sentence down into pieces. It's not a long sentence, but let's just see what each little piece of it means. So take a clear stance. That phrase alone means make an argument, a thesis statement. Take a clear stance on what? On an important real world issue. So you're talking about something going on in our world, our society. That's what you're probably used to doing in classes where you write research papers, and probably what you expected to do in English 201. So make an argument about a real world issue. That's pretty straightforward. Let's look at the next piece. Analyze a cultural artifact. We just talked about what a cultural artifact is on that last slide. Okay, so we know what that is. Analysis, we have some idea what that is. You just did a fake news analysis, so you know that analysis is critically reading a text, analyzing it in depth and detail to assess its meaning. But let's try to say that in a real straightforward, simple way. I do that in the last part of the sentence as evidence to prove your argument. So you've all made arguments before. You've said, let's go to lunch at Zips rather than at Subway. That's an argument. You can make arguments about anything. Here I'm asking you to make an argument about a real world issue. We already talked about how you probably expected that. Okay, so you make an argument about a real world issue. You need to prove your argument. If you say, let's go to Zips, not Subway. Your friend, if your friend is advocating for Subway, is going to say, why? That's where your evidence comes in. So you complete the thought. Let's go to Zips because. Or this is what I believe is true about real world issue, fill in the blank. So because, fill in the blank. So let's go to Zips because the food is high quality, the prices are reasonable, and that's a very comfortable place to eat. 3 really solid reasons. Those reasons are evidence to prove your argument, but you need evidence to prove those reasons. So reason 1, the food is really high quality. You give some examples and explain. This is where they get their bacon, and it's real bacon. It's thick. It's not like the cheap, thin stuff you get at Subway. Okay, there's evidence to prove your first point. The prices are reasonable. Your friend says Subway costs less. You say yes, but if you look at the quality of the food, you're actually getting more value on the dollar per what you buy. Finally, it's very comfortable. You could describe the layout of the place. So there's lots of seating, nice big booths. So you've got evidence to prove your reasons that prove your argument. That's a very simple, straightforward presentation of an argument, probably familiar with that type of skill set. Okay, how do you do that in this assignment? Thesis statement. You make an argument about the real world issue because you give a reason why. What is your evidence? That's where the assignment becomes unique because your evidence is the cultural artifact. So you could say something like, this film shows that fill in the blank is true about this real world issue. And then you could go through 3 or 4 or a few examples from the film. This scene illustrates this point, which is a part of understanding my thesis. This scene illustrates another point, which is a different part of my thesis. So the cultural artifact, the text from popular culture, is your evidence to prove your argument about the real world issue. Like I said, pop culture reveals a great deal about our culture. You can now take the pop culture, give your opinion of it, and use it to articulate your opinion about the cultural issue you want to discuss and want to voice an opinion about. So my goal here is that the assignment will be fun. It'll give you a new creative way of talking about real world issues and things that matter by doing it, by talking about texts, films, shows, video games, whatever that are interesting to you. If you've taken English 101 from me, or even some of the other professors at EWU, because several of us do a pop cultural analysis in 101, you'll see that this assignment is very similar to the final assignment I teach at the end of 101. That's because I believe this skill of being able to analyze pop culture and use it as a means of talking about what matters in our world is really, really important. So I teach it in both classes. I believe it's that important because if you can learn to do that here, then you can learn to do it anywhere. You can make a great argument about why you're the best fit for a job, or you can convince your parents to help you purchase a vehicle because you learn those foundational skills of argumentation, reasoning, doing research, using evidence, but you learn to do it in creative ways because how you might be a good fit for this job, all the reasons may be really generic. Or making that argument to your parents or to your friend or whoever you're trying to persuade, your reasons may be really generic. So how do you liven up that conversation? How do you present evidence that's compelling and not boring? You have to be somewhat creative and innovative. Pop culture is a means of doing that. For this assignment, you won't always be able to use pop culture, but the training you get here by using pop culture will help you in general become a more creative person when you make arguments. So we do it in both classes. That said, you may have written a paper like this in 101. You cannot use the same paper. This has to be a new paper. But there are billions of pop culture texts out there to choose from and thousands of real world issues to choose from, and probably more than one thing you're passionate about. So I don't think that'll be an issue. Just make sure you don't reuse the same paper from 101. And if you have any questions about choosing a topic, please seek me out for feedback. By feedback, I mean to help you come up with your topic, to answer any questions you have as you're trying to choose a topic. So to sum up, there's the two parts of the paper. The real world issue, you're making an argument about that. And then the cultural artifact, you're analyzing that to prove your argument. Like I said in lesson 4, when we looked at the prompt for the fake news assignment, I always include a purpose statement, which is a reason for doing the assignment, because as a teacher, I believe in transparency to the utmost. So I'm not going to ask you to do something just because I'm the teacher. I'm going to ask you to do something because there's a very good reason why. I'm going to tell you what that reason is. And furthermore, I frame that reason around knowledge and skills. What do you learn by doing this? And what skills do you gain that'll help you put that knowledge into practice? So for this particular assignment, you gain rhetorical knowledge, primarily developing rhetorical strategies. We talked about rhetorical analysis at the start of the quarter. Here you get to develop your own rhetorical strategies. So how do you become someone who's very good at persuading people, to making people believers in your ideas, to changing people's minds about things you care about? How do you do that? That's the knowledge you'll gain. What are some of the skills it takes to do that you'll gain by doing this assignment? Argument. You're going to persuade people to think differently about this real world issue. So when you make the argument about the real world issue and you think of your audience, don't just think of people who already agree with you. because if you want to create change in the world, you have to change people's minds. So you're going to learn how to be persuasive. You're going to learn how to make effective arguments here. There's probably not a more important skill you could learn when you're in college, because you can take that with you everywhere you go, to every conversation, to every email, to every task you're given. But what are some of the skills you need to make good arguments that you'll also learn by doing this assignment? Analysis of evidence. So just like I said, you say, this is what I believe about this. I believe you should hire me for this job. I believe I should work at, or I believe we should eat at this restaurant. People are always going to say why. You want to know why? Here's my evidence. Well, why does that evidence prove it? You can say Zips has better quality stuff, but why does that mean we should eat there? You analyze the evidence, you explain it. So analysis and evidence are two skills you gain by doing this assignment that make you better at argument, that make you a great rhetorician, a great persuader. And again, the particular evidence you're going to use here is a popular culture text, because that will help you be more creative when you go out into the world and you make arguments. Finally, there's a really important part of this paper, and this is one of the ways it's different and new from 101 and builds on what we did in 101. I'm going to ask you to do an infosphere in lesson 8, and you're then going to take that infosphere from lesson 8 and actually make it a part of your paper. What's an infosphere? We're going to study what it is in lesson 7, and then you're actually going to do one in lesson 8. So I'm not going to take a lot of time to explain to you what an infosphere is now, because my lessons are already long enough, as I'm sure you're aware. So to say it real quickly, it's where you take different pieces of research and synthesize them, put them together. So you'll have your argument, you'll have some research to show what people have already said about this topic and to show how your argument adds something new about this topic. And then you'll have your analysis of evidence to prove your argument. And these are the different skills you learn. And if you really hone these skills here, you'll do great in your other college classes, and you'll do great anytime you're trying to persuade someone of something. What are some other important parts of the paper in addition to your basic task and the skills you'll gain by doing it? Choosing a text. This was on that first slide, but I didn't address it, so I'm glad it's here. You can choose almost anything you want. I don't want to say you can choose anything, so that's why I say almost anything, but it's pretty much true. A film, a TV show, a painting, a poem, a novel, a graphic novel, a series of comic books, a video game, you name it. If you have any questions or concerns about the text you're choosing, just send me an email or ask me, and I'll help you think through whether it's a good choice or not, but odds are it probably will be most of the time. Audience, just like before, remember that this is an academic class at a university, so you want to keep the language professional, and don't do too much summarizing. If you're writing about a movie or something like that, you will have to do some summary. You don't want to assume your audience knows every detail of the plot. But writing on a text like this, even more so than the last paper, it becomes easy to just get lost in the summary and not analyze the piece at all. So you want to make sure that the analysis is very brief, maybe like a 4 or 5 sentence summary of the plot early in the paper. And then later on, if you're describing a certain scene that wasn't included in that overall summary of the plot, 1 or 2 sentences here or there. But, the majority of the paper, 70, 80% of the paper, analysis of the film. And remember, when you think about audience, you're trying to persuade people. Imagine a reader who does not agree with your stance on the issue. How would you persuade them? Pop culture is a great way to approach that. But what else? Be thinking about, when you think about how you phrase things, the points you make to support your stance, how are you going to persuade them? Maybe it's a new topic they don't know much about, so you're kind of informing them some as you make your argument. Maybe it's an older topic and they've heard a lot of arguments before. Those same arguments won't convince them because they haven't before. So that's why you need the pop culture. That's why you need new, creative, innovative ideas. And the pop culture will help you get there. Requirements, the rough draft should be 1,250 words. So about 5 pages, and the final draft 1,500 words, so approximately about 6 pages. So it's a little bit longer than the paper from 101, and that's because it's 201, obviously, but so that you go into more depth and more detail, because it's an advanced research analysis, and because the research component is bigger than in 101, which I'll talk about in a minute. First, I'm going to mention that you need to include at least 2 visuals. Now, this is not something that we did on the first paper. You could have done it, but you didn't have to. Here, because most of the text people will choose to analyze, I guess unless you choose a novel, for the most part, they'll have a visual component, and this is a way to just make your analysis more robust. So include a couple of images. I have instructions on Canvas on the assignment sheet of how to include them. That's all very straightforward. You can just read that. The one thing I'll comment on here is that you don't want to just drop the picture into your document. It should be part of your evidence. You can analyze quotes. You can analyze events if you summarize the plot, if you're doing something with a narrative like a film, but analyze the images. How does this picture show the point you're trying to make? Explain that. And that visual analysis is a great way to drive your argument home to readers. So here's the research component I was talking about before. That's bigger than 101. You need 6 secondary sources. So on the next slide, we'll talk about the different types of sources. Note here that your cultural artifact you're analyzing is what we call a primary source, and your other sources are not primary, they are secondary sources. So you really have 7 total if you include the cultural artifact as one. And with the infosphere, you want to synthesize them, make connections between them. So the research component is bigger, the paper is longer, you're learning in more depth and detail some of the skills you learned in 101, but particularly with the infosphere, you're learning more about how to do research, how to synthesize research, and how to show, most importantly, show the uniqueness of your argument. So these are the other things, kind of the basic things, length, source count, that you need to have in your paper. And finally, like I said before, be sure to use that criteria for success, which is really a rubric at the bottom of the assignment sheet, as a checklist to make sure you have and you've done all the things on there. Let's talk a little bit more about this research component. We'll talk about it much more in lessons 7 and 8, since that's where you'll learn what an infosphere is and then do one. But you need to know what these different types of sources are. So like I said, the primary source is the artifact you analyze, because you're focusing on it in more depth and detail than any other source in the paper, because it is the means to prove your argument. It is your evidence. Secondary sources provide context and support. So they don't really prove your argument. They help readers understand the context of your argument and why your argument is unique. That's why they're secondary. Scholarly sources are one type of secondary sources. We're going to talk about 2 types here. So these are peer-reviewed and found through the library. You've probably, when you've done research projects before, if it was for another college class or in high school, what you probably were familiar with there and had to find were scholarly sources. But there's another type called popular sources, which are web articles found online that talk about usually popular culture. And the Halloween article we'll look at the end of the lecture is an example of one of these. These can be very useful and very helpful, but they're not always reliable in the way that scholarly sources are reliable. And so you just did a fake news analysis, so you know how to analyze a source and determine if it's credible and reliable. And that's why we did the fake news analysis, one of the reasons. So your sources you find have to be credible. Use the CRAP test and use the SIF test. Kind of the stigma around popular sources has been, well, scholarly sources are automatically credible. That's mostly true, not always true. You probably certainly have to do less sifting with scholarly sources, but you still should, because we all seen examples in the last few lessons of sources that seem very reliable and weren't actually. So with all of your sources, use the CRAP and the SIFT tests. Use them much more with the popular sources, but round out your argument by having some of each. You're probably asking, do the sources need to be on the real world issue or on the artifact, since those are like the two pieces? Ideally, both. You'll probably find more scholarly sources on the issue and more popular sources on the artifact. I don't really care about the exact number on each as long as you have some of each and you address both in the paper. Some artifacts, it may be hard to find sources, even popular sources. If that's true, you can definitely have more sources on the issue. But if you really can't find any at all on your artifact, look at the genre of your artifact and find sources that discuss that genre in general. So if it's in Marvel film, maybe it's one of the most recent ones and there's no sources on it. You could find sources that talk about other Marvel films in a way that relates to your topic. But if you have any trouble finding sources, just email me and I'll help you. We'll figure out what to do. So the research process. You covered this in 101, no matter who you had as an instructor. It's an important part of 101. So we're not going to cover it in detail. What we're going to do here is review it quickly. Then in the next lesson, move on to the infosphere. So these are the steps of the research process. State your topic as a question. Turn your question into a position. Argument or claim would be synonyms for position, so basically a thesis statement. Narrow your position, so get really specific. And then qualify your thesis. On the next slide, we're going to talk about why start with a question. But basically, if you go into the process assuming you know everything about the topic, you're not going to have a very good argument. You need to have an open mind, be willing to learn more about it. I'm not saying you need to change your stance, although that could happen, but I'm saying have an open mind so that you learn more about the topic so that your argument is well-rounded, that you're not just making the generic points everyone's heard before, that you understand it, you understand the other side, you can respond to the opposition, that your knowledge of the topic is well-rounded, and so that your thesis is unique. If you don't learn anything from the research process, your thesis is going to be generic. And the whole point of the infosphere that we're doing in the next lesson is to show how your argument is unique. So start with a question, and then after you've learned about the topic, turn your question into a position. Take a stance on the topic after you've learned about it. Now, this does not have to be your thesis yet, because as you continue to go and research more, you'll narrow your position. So you might have a really general argument once you know enough to have an argument, and you need your thesis to be specific. So learn more and focus in. This is the particular specific argument I want to make. And finally, qualify your thesis. Don't make statements that include words like all or everything or everyone, because you can never prove that. Focus in as specifically as you can. So I said a little bit about why start with a question, but let's explore that idea further. This has to do with the importance of objectivity in persuasive writing. We've all seen some fake news, if not in lesson 4 than before. So we talked in SIFT about stop. And even though most of your assessment of whether something is credible has to do with logic, that initial step in SIFT, stop, has to do with emotion, right? What is your reaction? We can usually tell when something is fake news. If someone hasn't done a good job of covering their tracks, what tips us off is there's no objectivity. The argument is very biased. They're probably caught up in their emotions, and that's probably going to cause an emotional reaction in us. So that's a tip-off. So starting with a question is one way to remain objective in your writing. unlike those fake news pieces that are very biased. That doesn't mean you don't have an opinion. What that means is your opinion is supported by facts, evidence, analysis, so that you prove your opinion to readers, persuade them to agree with your opinion. You can have an opinion and still be objective. The way you're not objective is if you make your argument, if you try to prove your opinion through all kinds of unreasonable means. You don't use logical reasoning, you don't use good evidence, etc. So objectivity is valuing facts, setting feelings and personal biases aside. Feelings are very important. They can help us spot fake news. But when you want to remain objective, don't set them aside completely. You should be passionate about your topic, but don't let them override logic. Use emotion when it's necessary and helpful, but let logic dominate, and make sure your evidence is factual and true and not just made up stuff. Even if the made up stuff really illustrates your opinion, and even if your opinion is true and there's other facts out there to back it up, make sure you find the facts for your paper. Most importantly, set personal biases aside. You may really care and really be passionate about this topic, and you should write on topics you're passionate about, because that usually makes for better writing. But if you let that control you, you won't find the best research, you won't use the best evidence. And so you can have a personal bias, but don't let it rule you as you write. Feelings can spot fake news, but we need to be aware of our own biases. I kind of already said that. Why be objective? Well, I asked you to at least skim or review Sean Blanda's The Other Side Is Not Dumb, which we read in lesson 1 for this lesson, because I think Blanda, he just makes such a good point there. We can learn from the other side, and that might be the most important thing you can learn in this class, is don't dismiss someone's opinion just because we disagree with them. We can learn from them. And so how does this all come back to starting with a question? Well, being open-minded in the research process. So instead of saying, I want to say this about this topic and then trying to find evidence that proves it, say, I want to learn more about this topic. And after finding that information, slowly start to develop a very specific argument. And then you will be objective. And then you will give the other side its fair treatment. Even if you critique the other side and respond to them, do that, that's great, but do it in a fair, non-biased, objective way. Then you'll have a persuasive argument. And are objectivity and neutrality the same? No. You can have an opinion and prove it objectively. In persuasive writing, you can't be neutral. You have to take a stance. That's the very first thing I said on the task for the assignment. But you've got to do it in an objective way, because that's what will be convincing to your readers. Readers can smell bias a mile away, and they'll dismiss that article unless they want to read stuff they already agree with. But you're trying to persuade people. You're trying to persuade people's minds. So you're not writing to the people who already agree with you. So objectivity is the best way to convince people who don't agree with you to change their minds, and starting with a question is the best way to remain objective while writing. It sets you up to remain objective while writing because of how you start the process. It's the first step, and getting the first step right is so crucial. We can learn from the other side, like Blanda says, in the research process. So maybe as part of the research process, find articles that deal with both sides of the topic, that take both stances. I'm not telling you to change your opinion about something. I'd never ask you to do that, because trust me, there's a lot of opinions I have that I don't want you to change my mind about, but I want to learn from you. Even if I don't learn enough to change my mind, I want to learn from you. And that's the mentality to have going into the research process if you do ever want to change someone's mind. All right, 2 examples here, because I've explained what a research analysis of a cultural artifact is, but seeing is believing. Not always, as Spider-Man Far From Home shows. But I asked you to review the cultural struggle because it's a great example of a research analysis of a cultural artifact. So how is it that? Here's the author's thesis. Spider-Man Far From Home narrates a core struggle of an individual living in today's postmodern culture, a struggle for the truth while surrounded by lies. So how is this research analysis of a cultural artifact? Let's unpack this thesis to see. The cultural artifact is clearly Spider-Man Far From Home. That's pretty obvious. And the real-world issues are fake news, being manipulated by the media, postmodernism, and what the author calls a postmodern culture is really what people have come to call post-truth, that some people don't even believe truth exists. I disagree. I believe truth exists. And if you do a good job proving your argument in your paper, it can be an example of truth. But it's dang near hard to find the truth. And it's almost impossible for Spider-Man to find it in this film. So by using this film as an example, because you could tell someone fake news is real, people are going to try to trick you and manipulate you, and the person you're saying that to could be like, nah, I don't believe that, I'm good. And then you watch, especially in the second half of this movie, what happens with Spider-Man Mysterio and the scene, the first time he actually fights Mysterio once he knows Mysterio's a bad guy, that is downright terrifying. He doesn't know what's real or not. It felt like a horror movie while I was watching that. It was very intense in that sense. So you show that to someone, they're like, oh yeah, Mysterio just made all that up. The things you're reading on your computer may be just as made up and just as deadly. That's how you persuade someone. So this piece really shows how you can make an argument, but if you take a text from popular culture, use it as your evidence to illustrate that argument, you'll persuade people in a way that's very convincing, that might not be as convincing without the popular culture. So there's a great example of why this kind of analysis is important and how to do it. Let's look at one you're less familiar with. So what is this author's thesis? She says that both films, Halloween is the second newest Halloween movie, and The Haunting of Hill House, they both focus on mental illness and inherited trauma, as well as mothers so consumed with worry about their children's safety that they wind up separated or estranged from them. So what is that? Okay, so basically, like if you take Halloween as an example, the mother, Jamie Lee Curtis, is worried that her daughter's going to be killed by the serial killer that she's battled in all these movies. So it's a very legitimate concern for her child's safety. It's a legit concern about a real danger. That's important, a legitimate concern about a real danger. But she becomes so consumed by that, so obsessed with that, tries to control her daughter's behavior so much that her daughter no longer wants anything to do with her. As a parent myself, who, because I'm a parent and I love my children, I can't help but worry about my children's safety, this really hits home. And I think it's an important lesson we have here in this article, right? Because we have to find a balance. We need to protect our children. We need to make their safety a priority. But if we do it to a point, if we try to control circumstances that are beyond our control to such a great extent that in a way we're actually hurting the person or driving them away, that's not good. But it's easy to do because we care about our children. We're passionate about their safety. So that's an idea. Again, like with the Spider-Man example, you could just say that to someone like, okay. You could quote some statistics. You could quote some great psychological studies. But seeing it in a horror film where there's a real danger, but Jamie Lee Curtis still goes too far. Perhaps she doesn't. Maybe you disagree. We could debate that. But you see the point the author's making. You see her go too far despite a very real danger. You see it play out on the screen. That's so much more convincing. But people don't just automatically assume that when they see the film. You have to write the paper. You have to explain that. You have to analyze the film and show readers how it shows your idea. And that's a research analysis of a cultural artifact. And with an example like this, we can see how relevant, significant, and important it is. So hopefully through these examples, you see what I mean, what I'm asking you to do in the assignment. I'm really looking forward to seeing what text you choose, what topics you choose in reading your writing. I think this will be fun for all of us. We're just getting started, so start thinking about what you want to write on. In this particular discussion board, I'm asking you to talk about the value of objective writing, because that's so important, like we saw a couple of slides ago. So think about that, but also think about what you want to write on. In the next lesson, we'll start talking about how to do the research process. So thank you for listening and have a great day.